Greetings. My name is Eli Anderson. I'm the storytelling expert from the StoryAidEU project. I teach, lecture, and deliver a range of storytelling courses and productions and write a number of children's books. And today it's my pleasure to guide you through the exciting module, which is number 4, which is described as the power of stories. Now, what are we going to try and do during this period of time I have with you is to look at some of the things that I want you to walk away with. And one of those three things is to really kind of begin to understand what story is as a broad concept, to give you a few theories of story as defined by StoryAid, and some examples of story in practice. And so this particular overview will be looking at the history of story and its theory, story as a concept, fundamentals of storytelling, which I think is really important to kind of begin to grapple with, storytelling and its collaborative practice, which you'll be very excited to begin to think about. And we're going to look at there's some key stories, studies of story, model cases, and we're going to end up with some practical examples. Now, what's really exciting for me is to really kind of have a broad view of the history of story. And what's great is that stories, there are a number of different ways of looking at that. A person called Kowalski talks about the telling stories, which is grounded in the earliest forms of cultural standards. And it really begins to encapsulate legacies, one that I really feel is excellent. You also get some support from Yoda Wise. The second bit is really looking at the view of our world and our actions and the relationships that are woven with our language. And this is by someone I really respect, someone called Mel Madrona, and my guy. And he begins to look at the stories being exceptionally unique and reflect a little bit about what we are and who we are and what we do. Now, further on, there is a person called, there are a group of people, Suzuki, Feliam, Mola, Hassan, and Yehuda et al. And their early exploration of story is talking about the facilitation of an authentic connection. Pfeiffer suggests that your stories is used to support rehabilitation. I think many of you out there will be very excited to know that storytelling can be used to help vulnerable human beings become stronger, become more aware of themselves. And actually, one of the things it will do is help their recovery. But the last one, which I'm quite proud of, it really talks about the origins of story by a person called Sharan. And she uses narrative medicine to begin to analyze that. And my theory in terms of looking at how story can be a therapeutic and caring responsibility, I think is very exciting. And actually, as we go through this presentation, you'll be able to kind of pick that up. And it's really good, actually, that if you go through the presentation, it's useful to go back through that because those things will kind of chime for you. Now, the theories of story. Mel Madrona talks about the lives of the human being being storied, which is a very key concept. John Campbell talks about the human being following a cycle of story which is underpinned by the hero's journey. There's so much information out there that you can find, but definitely the hero journey is connected to him. Now, with Bowlby talks about much more business storytelling, and he talks about quantum story, and it's quite an involved way of looking at anti-story and how story is developed through a whole range of interactions. But what are the things that I quite like? There are a couple of things that I quite like, really. And one of the two things, one is called global reference theory by me. And this talks about the distinct characteristic or genetic predisposition to create story. And when that happens, those human beings' response to time and environment contribute to something quite magical. And this can be explored through quantum dynamic spatial architecture. And there'll be some juicy things through this module, but also within the StoryAid academic structure, that you'll be able to get some of these very interesting animations and very exciting. Now, story is a concept. This is quite important because really with Hall and Powell, they talk about knowing persons through their stories, narratives they tell, provides contextual detail and person revealing characteristics that make them individuals. That's a really key. If you scribble that down and walk around with that, you will find that that will begin to unlock a whole range of what's happening within this module. Now, the defining attributes, these are the things which is really that have come up through, not just through the literature that is available, but also some of the thinking that has put some of this module together. And those attributes split down into a number of different things that are useful to access. And the first one is talks about it's a non-invasive human process. That's quite key. It requires a professional to engage with the story, and we'll talk about the interaction between professional and the vulnerable person. That's a really key concept. There are spiritual experiences that take place as a result of the exchange of story. There is most definitely something that happens when you collaborate, you exchange stories, and that bridge creates something called a healing community. The patient-centered core of the sharing of the story creates the healing community between the professional and between the vulnerable person. Now, as I've said earlier, the patient and the professional exchange stories. But what is remarkable about that is that at one point, the guide, the person with slightly more power maybe, and the traveler, the person who's looking to be led, these, once the stories are shared, they can exchange roles. And you will find that as you begin to apply some of this work. Now, the stories are fundamental currency of healing. I don't need to say any more than that. They reaffirm the person, and it ensures that there is a getting better narrative that is much bigger than the narrative of a vulnerable person. Now, the active involvement and the experiential learning, there are two, well, actually more than two, but there's a defining attribute. And as we've said earlier, it is a non-invasive impact. It's non-invasive intervention, and undertakes that responsibility of treating and understanding the cultural aspects of those persons. The second talks about that you don't interrupt the person's story. Let them tell you, let them share. Your power shouldn't define how things can be shared between both of you. We're talking about creating a collaborative bridge. We've already spoken about the exchange of roles between guide and traveler, but also what we're talking about is that there is a spiritual and emotional and spiritual part to the care of the individual. Now, why is story so important? Well, story is defined as a holistic and culturally co-created experience which authentically navigates and engages human beings in a dynamic process of sharing, learning, and celebrating our interconnected lives. This felt so powerful when we completed the Delphi project, the Delphi research. And there were two people who were very important in that, Professor Dyack and Dr. Falconer. And they found out that across the world, people wanted or have used storytelling to begin the process of rehabilitation and recovery and changing the way that the patient and the professional interconnect and share. And this was something that they wanted, that a whole range of professionals wanted to begin to look at. Now, we've talked about the collaborative practice, but what's really interesting is that nurses and people from the medical disciplines all wanted to use that. And here, what we're trying to do here is provide an opportunity where you can experience that, do a little bit of work, and then apply it. Now, what I want to tell you about is something around the way that storytelling is actually part of the fabric of how we do work. And it's interesting because the World Health Organization have begun to look at how they use story. It's not going to be in the same way as we do, but it's really important that we begin to use story not as an adjunct to what we do, but actually to weave it within the processes that we use as professionals. Now, another really important aspect of storytelling is the way that it can interconnect with other professionals in the way that IPE, which is interprofessional education, can do. Now, once you link IPE and storytelling, what you have is an exceptionally exciting way of integrating collaboration. And earlier we talked about the collaborative bridge. What you're doing now is advancing that in such a way that you're building, as we said earlier, a healing community, a community in which the patient, the vulnerable person, feels as though they are being supported by more than one person, and that can include their loved ones. There are many key studies that you will see that come up in this presentation. I don't need to really go through them all, but I would say that you could stop this for a bit and scribble down exactly some of the critical studies that you will need to do. And I would urge you to read at least, if not all, at least a substantial amount of them. You'll see this particular model case, and this model case really talks about the impact of a stroke on Melda and how people surrounding that person ensures that they can not only still see themselves as a human being with power and with their previous position, but also how by the interaction between all those people that are surrounding them, that they create a collaborative bridge between the people that are surrounding them and the vulnerable person and the professional, but also they're able to interact with the person, not just by talking to them, because the person who has a stroke may not be able to communicate in that way, but you can communicate in a whole range of different ways and respect the person. And the interaction between that will create the dynamics, it will create the field, it will create the opportunity where you're building around that person, you're building a healing community, and you can be invited into that and invite other professionals to respect the person that is there that has a stroke. It means they have a stroke, an injury. It doesn't mean they're any less of an individual, any less of a human being. So really there are a number of practices, and you'll see from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, from Tasmania in Australia, and from York in the UK. You'll be able to read that at your own leisure, but I would urge you to read those things because you'll get a flavor of what's taking place around you. So really, to wrap up, we're looking at shared stories being a way of co-creating a healing story, storytelling being fundamentally supportive and celebrating the person. It reaffirms the humanity and it understands that narrative of getting better, which is not just a physical goal, but it's something wider and more impactful. And so when stories heal, a whole range of things happen. Holistic processes take place, sharing identities take place, and the power of those stories ensure that everyone can be a part of the story of recovery. Thank you.